Welcome, everybody. My name is Tim Burris, and today I want to talk about creating separate business or domain models from your data models. And here I'll quickly illustrate what I mean, and then we'll jump into some examples. The other day I was chatting with a couple of colleagues, and they are talking about a new engagement they're about to embark on. And we were talking about the different layers they were going to use in their new solution. And obviously, one of them was going to be the data layer, and in that layer was going to have models that are from the database. So typically, this would be either from Entity Framework Core, or maybe they're just POCOs if you're using Petapoco or Dapper or something like that. But so they'll have these models, and they're either going to use Entity Framework or repository pattern. So we would also have repos or maybe a DB context, depending on the approach they take. And then, as you'd expect, there's going to be a presentation layer, and in that presentation layer, you're going to have your controller actions, and maybe or razor pages, depending on the technology they select, and you might have some view models here. And typically, what you would see is, there's going to be a service layer in the middle here that is going to go and use those repositories of that DB context, get those models, and it's going to then return those models to the presentation layer, and do whatever magic it needs to do to use the right repos and use the DB context. But my argument is that they should actually create a second set of models here and let the service layer translate all of these models into business or domain models, and then only those models get sent to the presentation layer. And one of my colleagues commented, rightfully so, well, that's going to be a lot of extra work. And sure enough, it is going to be a lot of extra work duplicating all these models, or kind of replicating most of these data models. But I want to show some examples of why I think this is a good approach. And so we'll jump into some code here. Here we have a real data model in a real application that I built. I don't want to dive too far into the context and spend a bunch of time on it, but a location would be like a company location. So let's say you had a Best Buy, and there might be a different location, one on 6th Street and one on Main Street. So this model is meant to represent multiple locations for a company. So this is what my table looks like. These are Petapoco generated models. This location has different fields like you'd expect: a primary key, a company ID which points back to the parent, address information, and then some kind of audit information like who created it, when they created it, who updated it, when they updated it. An assigned salesperson, and whether or not it's active. So this is pretty standard. This is what you would see many times in a data model. And my argument is this is exactly what you want in your data model, but this is not what you want coming out of your business or domain, because there are things here that aren't useful, aren't needed, or shouldn't be allowed to come through to the presentation. So I'm going to jump right over into my location model. That would be coming. This would be my business or domain model, and I'll view these side by side so you can see them. So there are some similarities. Primary key, reference to the parent record is active, but then we do start to get some differences. So for one, I like to have an address block that my service layer computes. And so, it'll take your address one, city, state, zip, and it'll build a nice formatted address block. If you don't include certain pieces, it'll format it appropriately. But I choose not to save that in the database, because then I have to recompute it. I could store it in the database, but I'm not. So this is one example of a single field that I want to come back from my service, but is not part of my data model. And I shouldn't be required to put it in the data model just because I want to be able to pre-compute it. If I choose to put it in the database, then that's up to me, and I would just add it to my data model here, and it wouldn't change the output. Additionally, instead of returning the primary salesperson user ID, because this is extremely important in this particular application, I'm electing to have my service model translate that ID into the actual user model of the salesperson. So instead of including the user ID and letting them, making them have to go and look it up, I always translate that directly into the model. And so I would do that for all of my lookups that are important enough to translate from ID. So instead of returning the ID for the salesperson here, I'm just going to return the entire model. And then similarly, I don't want to expose my created and updated information, because that's really for behind the scenes. That's primarily for me to go in and kind of figure out things. But one of the things is they do want to know the last time that it was changed, or that's important for me to expose. So I have this last change date, and in my service, what I would do is I would figure out, is there an updated date, and if not, use the created date, and if there is an updated, use the updated on date. But again, that should be hidden from my presentation layer, and I can do that in my service layer. I'm not going to dive into the actual implementation of how all that translation happens. I may do that in a deeper dive video. What I want to get out of this presentation is to show my argument for why I think it's valuable to separate your data model from your business model and return your business models to the presentation rather than your data models. So we're not going to jump into how I translate all of these different things, only that it happens. Now, I do have some other examples that have even some more lookups. Let me check out. So in this model, I have quite a few more lookup, and then let me pull up the data model version of this. So we can see here a bunch of lookup IDs like container ID, which would be like drum or what have you, frequency, and material type, some different lookups. And then in my business domain model, I don't have any of these IDs. I don't have a material type ID or frequency or container. Instead, I'm actually returning the model, the lookup for that material type. It might have a name and a description or what have you, but instead of returning the IDs and then requiring the user or the developer to go and look those up, I'm actually translating those into models here in my service layer and returning a model that looks like what they need to use. Now, I don't translate like foreign keys, like this is the parent record. This is not about translating every single relationship. It's about translating the things that are most important to translate so that you can present. But for me, this is only one small part of it, because this is just the model that we are going to retrieve. I take it a step further, and I actually prefer to separate. We're going to go back to our location model, and I would suggest that you separate the update and create models as well. So here's my update model, and I'll also go ahead and pull up my create model as well, and so that I can show the differences between all three of these. So this is where you could definitely argue that it gets to be a lot of work, but at the same time, it's where I feel like you get the most power. So our location model here includes a bunch of things. It's primary key company. We already went over all of this. And things like address block, primary sales rep, and last change date. These are great, but you can't change. You're not allowed to change the last change date. That's something that your service layer will stamp automatically, and you don't get to change the address block. You should only be able to change the address, city, state, zip, and you know how the address block is computed as part of the service layer. So my update location model does not accept a company ID, because in this particular application, you can't move the location from one company to another, and I think it doesn't make sense to. You can't change the parent record here, so that is not part of the update. You can't change the address block, so it is not part of the update model. And it lets you define only the things that you're allowed to change, and then for salesperson, you don't give it a new sales model, you just give it the ID. And similarly, what you need to do to create a location is not the same as what you need to do to update a location. So when you create a location, you are required to provide the company ID and these other fields. Also, when you create a location in this particular system, it's active automatically. You don't get to choose whether it's active. Now, you can make the argument that when you create this model, it has it active and defaults to true. But for me, this particular situation, the is active flag is not part of the create, because when you create, it needs to automatically be marked as is active true, and that's something the service layer will do and is not exposed to the presentation. And then, of course, neither of these let you set the last change date. And if you're wondering about why there is not a location ID on here, which you might think, well, you need a location ID to know what you're changing. I actually define that slightly different. What I do is in my, let me look at my iLocation service, and I'll close out this create so that we have a little more space here. When I do an update location, I accept the integer location ID and then the model of the things that you're allowed to change. But you for sure could just include it as a property on here, but it feels different because these are the things you're changing, not defining what needs to be changed. So I like to keep those separated. But now this is just for a simple model. You'll run into these cases all the time where you have all these little things that need to be different between the location. I mean, between the data model and the business model. But then sometimes there are really big changes, really big differences that you don't need in every application or on every entity. But whenever you follow this kind of pattern, you'll be thankful that you have this power to separate. So I'm going to pull up another model here. I'm going to pull up the attachment. So in this application, users are allowed to add attachments to companies and other things. But so I'm going to pull up the attachment data model and the attachment business model, and I'll side by side these guys. Good. And these are very similar data and presentation models. Again, just the basics, and we're not exposing any of the created, updated information. But where it really gets different is when we look at the update models. So I'm going to go ahead and close the data model since we know what that looks like. And let's pull up the update attachment model and the create attachment model. So when you create an attachment, you'll specify the company, some metadata information, and you'll give it the actual byte array for the file. But when in the data model, you'll see that there is no byte array, and that's because I'm using Azure Blob Storage. And so what happens is when this create model comes into my service layer, it says give me the byte array, and then what it does, it goes and pushes that to Azure Blob Storage, and which creates a blob ID, a unique identifier for that record. In the data model, we store just the blob ID. So we generate that blob ID, and that's what gets stored in the data model. And that's also what gets returned in most of the time when you're querying the service layer and you're asking for attachments. We give the blob ID because getting the file data every time is a bit heavy. So that's a whole separate operation. So in this scenario, whenever I want to update or create an attachment, I have to give it the file data. But that's not part of my data model because it's not in my database. It's stored completely separately. And by having separate update and create models, it allows my service layer to decide, well, how does that work? Maybe you just have a separate table in your database, which would be fine. But I prefer to go to blob storage or something, especially whenever you're using Azure databases and size equates to money. So this type of pattern gives you the flexibility, the power to separate what the data models look like and where things are stored and how they're stored from how the presentation would like for them to come back. So absolutely, using this pattern means a bit more copy and paste for sure. You have to create your model, your business model. You have to create your update model, and you have to create your attachment model. And you might think, well, why don't I just create a base class and derive and this, or can I automatically generate them, this and this? The answer is maybe. Maybe you could do some of that, but that I think that defeats the power. The power of this is that you make the decision, the developer makes the decision, these are the things you are allowed to change. And these are the things that you're allowed to set when you create. And these are the things that you get back whenever you ask for a model. And those are case by case. Every model is different. Every entity is going to be different in whether it needs to be a lookup translated to a model, or whether it needs to be a formatted phone number, or whether it needs to be an address block added to it. Those are going to vary from every entity to entity. So if you're auto generating all of these guys, all three of these, then you're going to lose that power. And the biggest pain is just when you're getting started on this. You're going to be creating a lot of models. You're going to be copy and pasting, this entire set of fields, pasting them over here, and then killing the ones that you don't want. These are the ones you can't change, blah, blah. You're going to be doing that over and over. So it might feel a bit painful at the start. But once you're done with that real hard push at the start where you're creating tons of entities and you're only doing this for new features or making modifications, that's when you really fall in love with this and you're like, oh man, I'm so glad that all these are separate. When I create an attachment, you come back 6 months later and you're like, okay, I need to create a new model, and what fields do I need to set? And you just look at the create model and those are the things I need to set. You don't have to worry about, am I supposed to set created date? Am I supposed to set blob ID? Is blob ID automatically generated? All of that, all that goes away. So in a future video, I hope to jump into, well, how do you make all that happen? That's what I have for my argument for why you should take the time to split your data models out from your business or domain models. I hope you found something useful in this, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much.